I found these tables for free on the side of the road. Actually, only one of them was out on the curb, but when I asked the homeowner if it was okay to take it, she said yes, and they also had a matching one inside the house, which she then went in and got for me. So I got this matching pair of tables, and they were made by Lane Furniture Company in the 1950s. They're from their Copenhagen line, which was Lane's take on Danish modern. Both of these tables are dated on the underside, and one of them is dated 1957 and the other one is 58. And here you can see the difference between the veneer and the overall color. One of them has a very fancy veneer, and the other one is a lot more plain. These were in rough shape. The worst of the finish problems was a few burns, so I decided to give them a quick refinish. The first step was to remove the brass feet, and they were just held on by some small nails. Then it was time to apply the stripper. I just put on a nice heavy coat and let it sit for maybe 20 minutes or so. I found that that's usually enough time for the stripper to do its job on these old lacquer finishes. Then I scraped off the stripper goop. And I went over it with some steel wool and mineral spirits just to remove any residue. There were a few stubborn spots where the finish didn't come off with the first application of stripper, and in those spots I just used some lacquer thinner and steel wool, and it came right off. One of the tables had some very small dents in the top, so I tried to steam those out, and to do that I used a small soldering iron, and I just dabbed a little bit of water on the dents and then took a damp cloth and a soldering iron and applied the heat. This will usually steam out the dent, and it did a pretty good job in this case. Next came sanding, and I didn't use my electric sander on this because it's round. It's a round orbital sander, and this table is obviously got square corners everywhere, and it's also got that piece of trim, that lip that sticks up. And I don't like using the orbital sander in situations like this because you'll never get it into the corner, and also it'll keep bumping up against that raised trim and just kind of chew it up. So I just did it by hand, and I first taped off any grain that was going in the opposite direction, and then just gently sanded it. There weren't many, if any, imperfections to sand out, except for the burns, but they wouldn't sand out. They went too deep, so I didn't even attempt to sand those out. Next, it was time for stain, and I started with the trim and the legs. These were a lighter wood than the veneer on the top and on the top shelf. The top is walnut, and the trim and the legs are some type of a lighter wood. I'm not sure what kind. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to use this same stain on the top, so I first taped that off, and I just went over the trim and the legs. And in this case, I'm using gel stain, but it's not my usual walnut color. It's called nutmeg, and it just seemed to match the original color a little bit better than walnut. After the stain was on, the areas I put the stain on were still a bit light, so I went over it with some walnut lacquer toner. Just a very light coat, just to bring the color a little bit darker and a little bit deeper, so it would be more of a match to the top. When it was time to remove the tape I had put on, one piece unfortunately lifted some of the grain off of the walnut veneer on the top. So then I had to fix that before putting any finish on the top. And to do that, I just used some walnut water-based wood filler and applied it to any damaged areas, let it dry, sanded it a little bit until it looked good. I wasn't sure if I was going to use any stain on the top, but I decided in the end to use some stain, and I ended up using the same nutmeg stain that I put on the trim and on the legs. Once the stain was dry, it was time to apply the top coat, and in this case I'm using some satin wipe-on oil-based polyurethane. And here you can also see the burns, which actually didn't look as bad as I thought they would look once the melted finish had been removed. A few of the burns actually blended in pretty well to the veneer. They almost looked like knots, so I just left those alone. But there were a couple on an upper shelf that I wanted to try to tone down a little bit. So I just used some of this enamel paint that I had lying around. This is usually used for building model cars and things like that. And I just mixed some brown with some orange and just put a very light coat over a couple of the burns. And I wasn't trying to hide them completely. They still appear as dark spots, but they're not black. Now they're more of a brown color, and they blend in more with the color of the veneer, and almost could pass for just a natural defect in the wood. And once that paint had dried, I put more polyurethane over that. Last step was to put the brass feet back on. Here they are, all done. Thanks for watching.